Women have never been more prolific or influential in the Australian legal industry, and for many, it's a labour of learning and sacrifice. But does that mean we need to do it alone? Not anymore. This podcast by the Mentor Institute will unlock the potential of women in the workplace by tapping into the incredible experiences of successful professional women. Our founder, legal entrepreneur Val Pitt, believes mentoring is about embracing the success of a few to breed the success of many. She created the Mentor Institute to link with those who want a mentor and those who want to be a mentor in a new and unique platform for leadership. So, join your host, Jade Toomey, as she chats to sophisticated women across the country and meet the legal ladies, some of the most inspiring women in law.
Helen McGowan is the Principal Solicitor at Halliday Solicitors in North East Victoria. She's got more than 3 decades of experience in private and community law. Helen talks a lot about finding her people. She's really passionate about rural communities and regional communities in law and how professionals from all backgrounds and from all corners of the country can learn from each other and make the profession better. Helen's been a national coordinator with the recruitment and retention of lawyers in rural, regional and remote Australia. And she also did her PhD on how remoteness might affect the way that a lawyer identifies and responds to potential conflicts of interest. Helen, thank you so much for joining us. You're a very successful principal lawyer in the beautiful town of Beechworth. You've got decades of experience in private and community law. Tell me how mentors have helped you get where you are today.
Wow. I've been particularly fortunate because I spent 10 years in the community sector here. We set up the cross-border community legal service in Albury, Wodonga. We set up a reference group to start with, and that was surrounded by pretty progressive social workers, psychologists and volunteer lawyers. And in terms of mentoring, they were very much like, this is how things happen in this town. These are the people you need to see. This is who you need to win over. And this is information that will be important if you're setting up a community legal service. So that sort of mentoring was very much a peer-to-peer sort of group mentoring. I think for me that was the most formative experience of mentoring. And then for me, our community legal service was then co-located with a whole bunch of other human service delivery, and had very much, we had a supervisory relationship where I every fortnight would have a chat to my boss for an hour or so, and we'd just go through pretty much a formal supervision process where he would give me feedback and I would give him feedback as well.
So what was it like in that first decade working with learning from those different disciplines that weren't just law? What was that like?
It was the best. Actually, before I came into the community sector, I worked in the private sector for about 5 years, which was a pretty horrible experience, actually. Even though we were in a regional town in a small law practice, it was all about making money. And so the whole idea of supervision as such was, here's a budget, make the money for the partners. Oh, you're not making enough, make more, work longer hours. And I couldn't stand it. I had to leave after 3 years. So I had a very negative experience of actually being overseen and managed by, I guess, my seniors. But then when I came into the community sector, working with the other disciplines like psychologists and social workers, they had an established ethos of supervision, which to them was, how is the work affecting you? And what is it that you're thinking about now? And what have you learnt from these cases that you've been working on? And I learnt the whole thing about reflective practice, which was, you're learning all the time, but what exactly are you learning? Let's surface some of those lessons and see whether your explicit knowledge now can actually make you a better practitioner. So it gave me permission to, I guess, feel vulnerable and to actually feel that even though I felt like I didn't know stuff, I could actually take that feeling of vulnerability and learn and become stronger from it.
There does seem to be a huge rise in platforms and organisations and groups that do seem to be focusing on that reflective practice that you learned when you were working with those other disciplines. Platforms like the Mentor Institute, which do have a big focus on finding a mentor and finding others who can lead you. What do you make of that sort of progression?
Well, I'm a big fan of it, and I know I'm more familiar with the Law Institute of Victoria and the Law Society of New South Wales. I do have formal mentoring programs, but I will say they're not really landing, from what I can tell, in regional practices. They seem to be more city-based, where you can go down the street and have a coffee with someone. And we did try and just start something off locally in my regional community, but a lot of the older lawyers were, I'm going to say, older men, and who had certain model of what it took to be a lawyer, which weren't really relatable to me. So I think still we've got a lot of that style of what's perceived to be mentoring in the legal profession. So I'm always on the lookout for how do we provide support, particularly for early career lawyers who are considering a life as a lawyer in the bush or regional areas. And I think what I'm seeing is more this peer-to-peer mentoring, where people are getting together and saying, you know stuff, I know stuff, let's get together over lunch for an hour or so and see how we can actually share the knowledge that we have.
And just how important is accessibility, particularly, as you said, for those lawyers and professionals in regional areas who, might not have as much access to resources as those in the city? How important is it to find your people?
Well, it's to me, finding your people is everything. And again, we've got the URBIS surveys from the law societies across Australia that show, well, a lot of the professions, I'm talking here specifically about New South Wales, has tipped over to 51% is female. And we know that the early career lawyers in the bush, that's outside the city areas, 67% of the early career lawyers are female. And I'm thinking there's a great opportunity for us as a profession of law to say, what is it like for you coming out here away from your people and being in this law practice, and how can we help you get through, particularly those critical first 2, 3, 5 years of practice? How do you survive with the sort of law that you're doing? So access is everything, but more than that, it's like we need a structure to actually match people up. I'm putting my hand up, I have a need, I'm putting my hand up, I can help. How do we actually identify people and match them up?
So you're talking, I guess, a little bit about being collaborative. And I think women in particular do tend to find collaboration as something that's beneficial. What have you learnt from being someone who's been able to teach young lawyers?
Well, what I've learned is that I need to model vulnerability and uncertainty. And, it used to be for me, before I knew that, I used to have to pretend that I knew everything, that if I didn't know stuff, I would just shut up and pretend that I knew stuff. But more recently, and probably it's turned with just becoming an older person, it's not really about whether I know or don't know. It's like, how do I go to find out the answer here? When I'm in a forum where information is being shared, I try to say, look, I'm not sure what this means. I've had this experience. I'm interested in what other people think about it. And I had some colleagues at the ANU who wrote a paper on being an ignorant and uncertain lawyer. And I thought, that sounds a really interesting sort of topic. And they've written about it in the Journal of Law and Society. And it's a fascinating thing about uncertainty in the practice of law. If we allow ourselves to recognise that we are uncertain and that often the results are uncertain, yes, we do the best we can. But if we recognise the uncertainty and to a certain extent our own ignorance, then it's less of a burden for us to carry, to think that actually we need to know everything. And I know in our own practice, we're a small law practice, but there's a concept in law called a pettifogger. That is a lawyer who's obsessed with the detail and who is almost paralysed by having to get all the detail right before they can take a decision. So while I love pettifoggers because they sort of know their law really well, they can also be frozen because of the desire to be perfect. And so my hope is that in a collaborative space that we can all say, does anyone know the law about this particular area? And hopefully there's someone who's had that experience who can then throw it into the mix. But also it takes really an environment of trust and respect and vulnerability to actually allow people to share. So what I do, I just model vulnerability.
Do you think that that's something that lawyers in regional and rural areas are perhaps better at or worse at, or I guess act differently to those who are in the metro and capital cities?
Yeah, that question really interests me. because I work in a small town, before we took over our practice, there was, I think, one main law practice with two partners. It split, and the two partners stopped talking to each other. I don't know why it split, but then for the next, I think, 7 years, the partners, they were no longer partners, they were now adversarial, and you really couldn't call them colleagues, they were adversarial lawyers, would not talk to each other in this small town. And I was like, what? And then much later, if you just do some research into the regulators' disciplinary matters, there's quite a few times you come up in small towns where the lawyers are behaving badly and there's a bad culture. And I'm going to say typically, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be gendered about it, but typically it's when there's been people who have been entrenched in a certain way of being, and then there's been a falling out and they're unable to build a bridge and get over it. So I don't think per se regional communities have actually got it sorted. But I think it very much comes down to the sense, the ethos of collegiality and civility. And that is part of our professional conduct and our rules, be collegial and civil to each other.
What's something that you wish you learned a little earlier in your career that you think that would be a good lesson to those who are hoping to be mentored at some point?
That's a great question. For me, it comes down to where is my line? Let's start with hours. How many hours of work do I want to do a week? How much do I need to be paid to sustain my working life and whatever it is I choose to do outside my work? And I need to be clear on what my boundaries are, and then put myself in the way of that happening rather than compromising. I think as a young lawyer, I compromised a lot because I thought it was important to sort of do what my boss wanted. And to a certain extent, that also led to compromise of my ethics in terms of being asked to do things that I didn't necessarily feel comfortable with, but I thought, I should do it because he's the boss and he's asking me to do it. So what I learned over time was that I was actually denying myself my own sense of agency by not having a clear boundary about things like time, money, and personal values.
And Helen, you mentioned that the majority of lawyers in rural and regional Australia are actually women. What sort of assets do you think that they can bring to the table and kind of work together to build the profession as a whole?
Yeah, great. Just a little bit of a correction. This is the URBIS National Survey, or the profile of Australian solicitors. And it's a sort of, I don't know whether it's every jurisdiction, but as a whole, across Australia, the early career lawyers, 67% are female. And I don't know how, maybe it pans out differently in different jurisdictions. But before I go too much further, I probably need to mention the great work of my colleague Trish Mundy. Trish did her PhD on rural women lawyers, which is a great read, out of Griffith, and now she's the Dean at the Law School at University of Wollongong. So if people were interested in this area, Trish writes regularly at an academic level on rural women lawyers. I think basically my experience of working with other women lawyers has been collegiality and collaboration, and a sense of recognising that there's more things in life that are important than actually being mean and horrible to your opponent, that you can actually represent your client's interests without sticking the boot in as well. But again, I don't want to be a Pollyanna or too naive about it. I know for many people, representing their client's interests can involve sort of sharp practice and, being tricky and sneaky as well. Women per se aren't full of virtue. But for me, I actually look out for the women. I think I actually trust my gut a little bit more with the women to say, this is going on, can you give me a hand here?
You are really interested in innovation and talking about where the good ideas are coming from and how that might be a little bit more challenging in rural and regional areas, or maybe not so prolific. What are you hoping the future of law in regional areas looks like?
I'm particularly fortunate because I'm surrounded by innovators, and because I work in a social enterprise space where we're the law practice there, and then we've got all these startup businesses that are always thinking, what would it take to do this and that? And so we often get asked to actually help them sort something out, like, I guess, governance documents or employment or hire agreements and terms and conditions that are consistent with the Australian consumer law. So we often ask, our first question is, what would it take? So instead of putting on that black hat and all the reasons why something is not going to work, what we ask is what would it take, and get that long lever question out there pretty quickly. And also collaborating with other people, other skill set to say, well, we've got some understanding of the law, but how do we trade off the risk, and what is the finance, the bottom line here, how do we make that go? So definitely with innovation, I think the reason why in the bush we can actually have more freedom to do it is that the consequences themselves aren't as, immense. And so we often start with a concept we call it proof of concept. We say, let's give this a go and try it for 6 or 12 months, and then we'll reflect on it and see what worked and what didn't work. Maybe people do that in the city as well. But for us, it's like we know our people, the clients we're working with, and they're willing to be experimental. And we have very much a sort of a framework about, well, we need to operate and get these things sorted. For example, a company's documents. There has to be annual compliance milestones addressed. But apart from that, we can be quite creative with the articles and the memorandum to actually encourage creativity. And the directors and shareholders agreements, there's a lot we can do that no one else is telling us how we should do it. We just make it up as we go.
And Helen, what last words would you have to say to those who are either hoping to be a mentor or searching for a mentor through the Mentor Institute? What would you like to add here?
Well, I think it's a search. It's a bit like be clear about what it is that you're after and think who can help me find out this information. So say, for example, many of the women I work with, that we're sort of moving on from employee into being the principal in the law practice. There's a lot of information from the law societies about how to set up a law practice, but the real thing is, okay, now you've been going for a year. How is it going? What is your next growth trajectory? And the way to do that is be really clear about your questions and then go and find the people who can help you sort that out.
And Helen, I think the Mentor Institute is probably a good place to start in terms of collating those tools to get started. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate all your wise words.
Thank you, Jade. It's great to know about the work of the Mentor Institute, and I look forward to sort of continuing to collaborate and to learn together.
You've been listening to Legal Ladies with Helen McGowan, the Principal Solicitor at Halliday Solicitors in North East Victoria. We'll have another sophisticated and inspiring story next month on the Mentor Institute.